A billionaire adopts a black baby with a birthmark matching his lost sister's. As they uncover the truth, what unexpected family connection will come to light? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The adoption ceremony took place in the Hawthorne family's sprawling estate garden, where Richard and Laura Hawthorne celebrated their newest family member. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn as their closest friends and relatives gathered around. 6-year-old Amara, wearing a pale blue dress carefully chosen by Laura, stood between her new parents, her small hand gripping Laura's fingers tightly. Richard watched as their family lawyer finalized the paperwork on a nearby table, making official what they had waited months to accomplish. The guests maintained a respectful distance, understanding the delicate nature of the moment. Among them stood Richard's parents, Thomas and Eleanor Hawthorne, their expressions a mixture of joy and something else, perhaps uncertainty about welcoming a child so different from their usual social circle into the family. Amara's eyes darted around the gathering, taking in every detail of her new surroundings. She studied the faces of distant relatives she would need to learn, the expansive garden she would soon call home, and the elaborate refreshment table that seemed to stretch endlessly. Her natural reserve showed in the way she pressed closer to Laura whenever someone approached, though she managed small, polite smiles when addressed. The ceremony itself was brief, but meaningful. The judge, a longtime family friend, spoke about the beauty of chosen families and the responsibility of parenthood. Richard and Laura exchanged meaningful glances throughout, their hands joined behind Amara's back in a subtle show of unity. When they signed the final documents, the small crowd erupted in gentle applause, careful not to overwhelm the child. During the reception that followed, Richard maintained his composure as he accepted congratulations and well wishes. However, everything changed when Amara reached up to accept a cookie from Eleanor. The movement caused her collar to shift slightly, revealing a distinctive mark on her shoulder, a crescent-shaped birthmark that Richard would have recognized anywhere. The sight hit him like a physical blow, transporting him 20 years into the past. The same mark had graced his sister Emily's shoulder, a familiar sight from summers spent by the family pool. The last time he had seen that birthmark was the day before Emily disappeared, leaving behind a devastated family and questions that remained unanswered for 2 decades. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet there it was, branded on his newly adopted daughter's skin. Richard excused himself abruptly, leaving Laura to handle the confused guests. He found refuge in his study, a room that still held traces of Emily in the family photographs lining the walls. His hands shook as he poured himself a drink, memories flooding back unbidden. Emily at 16, fiercely protective of her younger brother. Emily teaching him to ride a bike. Emily's empty room the morning after she vanished. Laura found him there 30 minutes later, concern etched on her face. She approached cautiously, recognizing the signs of her husband's distress. "Richard, the guests are asking about you." When he didn't respond, she moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What happened out there?" Richard couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. His mind was already racing, calculating possibilities and connections. "Amara has a birthmark," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Identical to Emily's. In exactly the same place." He turned to face his wife, his expression hardening with determination. "That can't be a coincidence, Laura. I need to know where she came from." Laura's attempt to reason with him fell on deaf ears. She recognized the look in his eyes, the same one he had worn during the first years after Emily's disappearance, when he had obsessively followed every lead, no matter how thin. "Richard, please. This is supposed to be a happy day. Don't let old ghosts ruin this for Amara." But Richard had already moved to his desk, pulling out his laptop. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as he began searching adoption records, birth certificates, anything that might provide a clue. Laura stood watching him, her happiness at the day's events slowly giving way to worry. Outside, they could hear the continued murmur of celebration, but inside the study, a new mission had begun, one that would unravel far more than either of them could imagine. Richard spent hours in the family's expansive attic, disturbing years of accumulated dust as he searched through carefully labeled boxes. The space held decades of Hawthorne family history, and somewhere among these artifacts lay Emily's personal belongings, untouched since her disappearance. He found what he was looking for in a cedar chest marked Emily, personal, its brass latches dulled with age. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed over time, lay Emily's journals. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the oldest one, dating back to the months before she vanished. The pages contained his sister's neat handwriting, filling entry after entry with teenage thoughts and secrets. As he read, one name appeared with increasing frequency: Clara. The entries about Clara stood out, describing a woman who worked at St. Catherine's orphanage, where Emily had started volunteering. Clara understands things nobody else does. One entry read, "She knows what it's like to feel trapped by family expectations. Today she told me about her own past, but made me promise never to tell anyone. I've never met anyone like her." Richard's attention sharpened as he noticed the changing tone of Emily's writing. The entries became more secretive, filled with cryptic references to meetings and conversations that Emily wouldn't fully detail. The final entry, dated just days before her disappearance, mentioned Clara again. "Clara says everything is ready. I'm scared, but I know this is right. Some things are more important than what people expect of you." The next morning, Richard drove to St. Catherine's orphanage, the same institution where they had adopted Amara. The building looked smaller than he remembered from the adoption process, its red brick facade showing signs of age. Inside, the administrative office held the same antiseptic smell common to institutions, mixed with the scent of old paper and furniture polish. Mrs. Henderson, the orphanage's director for the past 30 years, agreed to meet with him. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair and alert eyes that seemed to catch every detail. When Richard mentioned Clara, those eyes narrowed slightly. "Clara Matthews," she said, speaking the name carefully. "Yes, she worked here during that period. Quite good with the children, especially the troubled ones. But there was always something uncertain about her background." As Mrs. Henderson spoke, Richard learned that Clara had appeared at the orphanage seemingly out of nowhere, with excellent references that later proved difficult to verify. She had worked there for exactly 18 months before disappearing without notice, just 2 days after Emily had last been seen. "She had a way about her," Mrs. Henderson continued, her tone measured. "She could get people to open up, share things they wouldn't normally share. Some found it comforting. Others found it unsettling." Meanwhile, back at the Hawthorne house, Laura had discovered something unexpected about their new daughter. She had set up an art corner in Amara's room, hoping to help the girl feel more at home. What she hadn't expected was Amara's natural talent with the paintbrush. The child approached the blank paper with unusual focus for her age, creating images that showed remarkable depth and emotion. Laura watched as Amara painted a scene that made her breath catch, a woman's face, rendered in childish but striking detail. There was something familiar about the features, though Laura couldn't quite place it. When she asked Amara about the painting, the girl simply said, "It's from my dreams." Determined to nurture this talent, Laura began arranging for art supplies and considering children's art classes. She found herself spending hours in Amara's room, watching the girl paint and draw, feeling a growing connection that seemed to transcend their short time together. Sometimes, Amara would tell stories about her paintings, stories that hinted at memories or dreams that seemed too complex for a child her age. The art sessions became their special time together, a space where Amara gradually began to open up. She spoke more freely during these times, sharing fragments of memories from before the adoption, though she never mentioned her birth parents or earliest years. Laura noticed that many of Amara's paintings featured the same mysterious woman, always rendered with the same sad eyes and gentle smile. What Laura didn't tell Richard was that she had begun to recognize something in those paintings, a resemblance to old photographs of Emily that still hung in their hallway. She kept this observation to herself, worried about feeding into Richard's growing obsession with finding connections between their adopted daughter and his missing sister. Richard's investigation into Clara's identity consumed his days. He neglected his work at Hawthorne Industries, delegating responsibilities to his executives while he pursued every possible lead. His latest breakthrough came from tracking down Marcus Phillips, a former classmate of Emily's who now worked as a literature professor at the local university. They met in Marcus's cramped office, surrounded by towering bookshelves and the musty scent of old volumes. Marcus appeared uncomfortable from the moment Clara's name was mentioned, his fingers drumming nervously on his desk. "Emily trusted Clara completely," he said, his voice low as if sharing a confession. But there was something not right about their relationship. Clara knew things about people, private things they'd never told anyone. Emily became different after meeting her, more secretive. Marcus hesitated before continuing, glancing at the closed office door. "About a week before Emily disappeared, I overheard them arguing behind the library. Clara was saying something about responsibilities and bloodlines. When I asked Emily about it later, she got defensive, told me to stay out of it. That was the last real conversation we had." This information sent Richard down a new investigative path. He discovered that Clara had been involved with several families in the area, always young women from prominent backgrounds. In each case, the women had either disappeared or cut ties with their families entirely. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid attention at the time, but looking back, it formed a disturbing picture. While Richard pursued these dark possibilities, Laura's relationship with Amara continued to flourish through their shared love of art. Their home sunroom became an improvised studio, filled with easels, paint supplies, and countless finished pieces. Laura noticed that Amara's artistic talent seemed to emerge most strongly when she was processing emotions she couldn't express in words. One afternoon, as golden light streamed through the windows, Amara created a particularly striking piece, a landscape showing a hidden door in the trunk of an ancient tree. The detail was remarkable, down to the intricate patterns carved into the wood. When Laura asked about it, Amara spoke dreamily. "It's the secret place. The lady with the sad eyes used to tell me stories about it." Laura's confidence in her role as Amara's mother grew stronger with each passing day. She began to understand the subtle shifts in Amara's moods, learning when to offer comfort and when to give space. Their bond deepened through shared moments, midnight snacks during thunderstorms, quiet reading sessions in the garden, and long conversations about Amara's artwork. However, Laura couldn't shake a growing unease about the recurring themes in Amara's paintings. The mysterious woman with sad eyes appeared in various settings, standing by a window, sitting in a garden, reaching out toward an unseen figure. The resemblance to Emily became impossible to ignore, though Laura still hesitated to share her observations with Richard. One evening, while organizing Amara's finished paintings, Laura discovered a sketch hidden behind others. It showed a detailed drawing of a crescent-shaped birthmark, identical to the one Amara bore. The sketch was dated 3 months before they had even met Amara, yet it captured the distinctive mark perfectly. Laura carefully replaced the drawing, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the implications. The distance between Laura and Richard grew as he became more absorbed in his investigation. Their dinner conversations, once filled with shared plans and laughter, now centered around Richard's latest theories about Clara and Emily. Laura observed how his obsession was affecting Amara, who had begun incorporating darker elements into her artwork, shadows lurking at the edges of otherwise bright scenes, doors standing slightly ajar in empty corridors. Laura found herself in an impossible position, torn between supporting her husband's search for truth and protecting their daughter from the weight of unresolved family history. She watched as Richard's wall of investigation in his study grew more complex, covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes connecting seemingly unrelated events. The mystery of Clara and Emily threatened to overshadow the present, risking the stability of their newly formed family. The private investigator's office reflected its owner's methodical nature. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and a detailed timeline dominated one corner. James Cooper had spent 20 years tracking down missing persons, but something about the Clara case made him unusually cautious. He spread several photographs across his desk as he briefed Richard. There have been whispers about a woman matching Clara's description living in Milbrook, about 40 miles north, Cooper explained, pointing to surveillance photos showing a slender figure with graying dark hair. She's been careful, uses cash only, keeps to herself. But here's where it gets interesting. She volunteers at a local community center, working specifically with young girls from troubled backgrounds. The information energized Richard, who had begun to fear the trail had gone cold. Cooper continued, sharing his findings about Clara's apparent pattern of movement over the years. She would appear in a town, establish connections with local organizations, and then vanish completely just as questions about her background began to surface. The timeline stretched back more than 2 decades, predating her involvement with Emily. Richard absorbed every detail, already planning his next move. His corporate responsibilities at Hawthorne Industries had suffered in recent weeks. Board members were beginning to question his extended absences, and important decisions remained pending. Yet, he couldn't focus on business matters, not when he finally had a concrete lead on Clara's whereabouts. Without informing Laura, Richard began making regular trips to Milbrook. He established a routine, frequenting local businesses near the community center where Clara reportedly volunteered. The small town's residents quickly accepted his presence, sharing local gossip that helped him build a clearer picture of his target's movements. Meanwhile, Laura struggled with Richard's increasing emotional distance.
She
Chet him leave early each morning, returning late with a distracted look that suggested his mind remained elsewhere. Amara noticed the changes too, expressing her concern through her artwork. Recent paintings showed solitary figures separated by vast spaces, the colors growing progressively darker. One evening, Laura confronted Richard in his study, where papers and photographs covered every surface. "You're pulling away from us," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Amara needs stability right now, not a father who's constantly chasing ghosts." Richard barely looked up from his notes, mumbling about being close to a breakthrough. Laura persisted, sharing her observations about Amara's emotional state. "She's settling in so well, developing her own interests, making friends at school. But she needs your presence, Richard, not just your protection. Whatever you discover about her past won't change who she is now, our daughter." The word daughter finally caught Richard's attention. He looked up, meeting Laura's gaze for what felt like the first time in weeks. "What if she's more than that?" he asked quietly. "What if she's the key to understanding what happened to Emily? Don't we owe it to both of them to uncover the truth?" Their conversation was interrupted by Cooper's urgent call. He had managed to track Clara's movements to a specific address, a modest house on the outskirts of Milbrook. Richard's pulse quickened as he listened to the details. After 20 years of questions, answers seemed tantalizingly close. Despite Laura's protests, Richard decided to drive to Milbrook immediately. The autumn evening was drawing in, casting long shadows across the road as he made the familiar journey north. His mind raced with possibilities. What would Clara reveal? How was Emily connected to Amara? The questions that had consumed him for weeks might finally find answers. Laura watched him leave, standing in the doorway of their home with a growing sense of foreboding. Upstairs, she could hear Amara working on another painting, the gentle brush strokes a counterpoint to the tension filling the house. The distance between what Richard sought and what their family needed seemed to grow with every passing day. The evening sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Milbrook as Richard spotted Clara sitting alone at an outdoor cafe. She appeared older than in the photographs from St. Catherine's, her dark hair now streaked with silver, but her penetrating gaze remained unchanged. Richard approached her table with practiced casualness, his heart pounding despite his composed exterior. Clara showed no surprise at his appearance, suggesting she had anticipated this confrontation. "Richard Hawthorne," she acknowledged, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "I wondered when you'd find me." Her voice carried a quiet authority that Richard remembered from Emily's descriptions in her journals. The conversation that followed proved frustrating. Clara deflected direct questions about Emily with practiced skill, speaking instead in cryptic references and half-finished thoughts. When Richard mentioned Amara's birthmark, however, a subtle shift occurred in Clara's demeanor. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee cup. Emily had secrets, Clara finally offered, her words measured and deliberate. Secrets she chose to keep, even from you. Sometimes protecting those we love means letting them believe we've abandoned them. Before Richard could press further, she stood to leave, adding, "Your sister made her choices, knowing the consequences. Perhaps you should ask yourself why you're really here, Richard. Is it for Emily? Or for Amara?" Frustrated but unwilling to let the lead slip away, Richard followed Clara at a distance as she left the cafe. She walked purposefully through Milbrook's quiet streets, eventually reaching a modest Victorian house surrounded by overgrown gardens. Richard watched from behind a weather-the oak tree as Clara entered the house, noting how she checked her surroundings before unlocking the door. After darkness fell, Richard crept closer to the house, drawn by the warm light spilling from its windows. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see into what appeared to be a study. The walls were covered with photographs, and among them, one image captured his attention: a younger Emily, smiling broadly, holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. The infant's dark skin contrasted sharply with Emily's fair complexion, but the connection between them was unmistakable. The discovery sent Richard staggering backward, his mind racing to process the implications. The timing, the birthmark, Emily's secret relationship with Clara. Pieces of the puzzle began falling into place, forming a picture he hadn't dared consider. Could Amara be more than just a coincidental connection to his sister? The possibility that Emily had given birth to a child she needed to protect transformed every assumption Richard had made about her disappearance. Returning home well after midnight, Richard found himself unable to sleep. He paced his study, reviewing adoption papers and Emily's journals with fresh eyes. The timing aligned perfectly. Emily had vanished shortly after the period when Amara would have been conceived. But why would she hide her pregnancy? What circumstances had forced her to give up her child? The weight of these questions pressed heavily on Richard as he considered their implications for the adoption. He and Laura had legally become Amara's parents, but if she was truly Emily's daughter, their role took on a completely different dimension. They weren't just giving a home to an orphan child. They were reuniting a fractured family. Dawn found Richard still awake, grappling with his next steps. The truth about Amara's parentage could potentially invalidate the adoption, bringing unwanted attention to both the child and the Hawthorne family. Yet concealing such information felt like a betrayal of both Emily and Amara. The complexity of the situation demanded careful consideration of all potential consequences before taking action. Laura's suggestion of a family vacation came from a place of desperate concern. She had watched Richard's obsession grow, noticed how he would stare at Amara during dinner, studying her features as if searching for traces of Emily. The tension in their home had become unbearable, threatening to suffocate the fragile bonds they'd built with their daughter. She proposed the idea one evening in their bedroom, after Amara had gone to sleep. "We could go to the beach house in Cape Cod," Laura suggested, keeping her voice steady despite her anxiety. "Just the three of us, away from all this." She gestured vaguely toward Richard's study, where his wall of investigation had grown to consume nearly every available surface. Richard's response was distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere. "I can't leave right now, Laura. I'm too close to understanding what happened." He sat on the edge of their bed, shoulders hunched under the weight of his discoveries. "Emily had a child. Amara is her daughter. Don't you see what this means? Every decision we make now affects not just our family, but Emily's legacy." The revelation stunned Laura into momentary silence. Though she had suspected a connection, hearing it stated so plainly made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Does this change how you feel about Amara?" she asked carefully. "About being her father?" Before Richard could respond, they heard movement in the hallway. Amara stood in their doorway, clutching her favorite sketchbook. "Can I ask something?" she said, her voice small but determined. "About where I came from?" The question hung in the air between them. Laura moved instinctively toward Amara, but Richard remained frozen, caught between his role as a father and his quest for truth. Amara continued, her words carrying wisdom beyond her years. "The other key. DS at school talk about their birth parents. I want to know about mine too." Laura guided Amara to sit between them on the bed, noting how the girl's fingers nervously traced the spiral binding of her sketchbook. Richard watched them, his expression torn between protection and revelation. The family portrait they presented felt simultaneously fragile and unshakable. "Everyone has a story," Laura began carefully, meeting Richard's eyes over Amara's head. "Sometimes those stories are complicated, with parts we don't fully understand yet." She chose her words deliberately, aware of the delicate balance between honesty and protection. Richard finally spoke, his voice rougher than usual. "What matters most is that you're here now with us." But even as he said the words, Laura could see the conflict in his eyes. His need to uncover the truth about Emily Ward with his desire to protect Amara from potentially painful revelations. The conversation about the vacation remained unresolved, but it had opened a new dimension in their family dynamic. Amara's simple question had forced them to confront the reality that their search for truth couldn't remain separate from their role as parents. Every decision they made now would shape not only Amara's understanding of her identity, but also her sense of security within their family. Later that night, after Amara had returned to bed, Laura found Richard in his study again. "We can't keep living in limbo," she said firmly. "Whatever you discover about Emily, about Amara's birth, it doesn't change the fact that she needs parents who are fully present, fully committed to her now." Richard's response was barely audible. What if knowing the truth could give her everything, her history, her heritage, her mother's story? And what if pursuing that truth costs her the stability she needs right now? Laura countered. "We're not just investigators, Richard. We're her parents. That has to come first." The decision to visit St. Catherine's orphanage arose from Richard's growing need to merge his investigation with his family responsibilities. The building looked different now that he approached it, as both an investigator and a father, each weathered brick seeming to hold secrets about both Emily and Amara's past. Laura walked beside him, holding Amara's hand, her presence a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of uncertainties. Inside, the institutional atmosphere remained unchanged, the same linoleum floors, the same faint scent of cleaning supplies mixed with children's lunch. But now they noticed details they'd missed during the adoption process. Faded photographs on the walls showing decades of children who had passed through these halls, perhaps each carrying their own mysteries like Amara. While Richard spoke with administrators about accessing historical records, Amara wandered toward a group of children playing in the common room. Laura watched as their daughter approached a girl sitting alone by the window, drawing in a tattered notebook. The connection between the two children was immediate and magnetic, as if they recognized something in each other that others couldn't see. The girl's name was Maya, and when she looked up at Amara, both Richard and Laura noticed it. Another crescent-shaped birthmark, this one visible on her wrist. The coincidence seemed too precise to be random, especially given everything they'd learned about Clara's involvement with the orphanage. The two girls sat together, sharing the notebook, their dark heads bent close in conversation, as if they'd known each other for years rather than minutes. Richard's research in the orphanage records revealed a pattern he hadn't expected. Over the years, several children with similar birthmarks had passed through St. Catherine's, all arriving under mysterious circumstances, all eventually adopted by prominent families. The dates corresponded with Clara's movements between different cities, creating a timeline that stretched back even before Emily's involvement. Laura observed the growing friendship between Amara and Maya, noting how their interactions seemed to awaken something in their daughter. Amara spoke more freely, laughed more easily, as if Maya's presence had unlocked a part of her that had remained hidden. When the girls showed their drawings to each other, Laura noticed they shared not just artistic talent but a similar style, the same ethereal qualities, the same attention to symbolic details. The visit took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Henderson, reviewing old files with Richard, mentioned a sealed record regarding a group of children who had arrived at the orphanage 20 years ago. There was something unusual about those cases, she explained, her voice lowered despite the empty office. All the paperwork was handled personally by Clara, and all the children had distinctive birthmarks. We were told they were part of a special program for gifted children. As Richard processed this information, a commotion from the common room drew their attention. Amara and Maya had created a joint artwork, a complex drawing that depicted what appeared to be a family tree. But instead of names, they had drawn symbols, crescents, stars, and spirals that seemed to connect invisible across generations. The other children had gathered around, some pointing to the symbols with recognition in their eyes. The scene affected Richard profoundly. Watching Amara connect with Maya, seeing the birthmarks that linked them, understanding the larger pattern at play, it all suggested a deeper mystery than he'd initially imagined. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about a network of children, all somehow connected through Clara's intervention, all bearing the same distinctive mark. Laura recognized the shift in her husband's expression. The investigators' determination remained, but it was now tempered by paternal concern. These weren't just clues in a case anymore. They were children, each with their own stories, their own needs for protection and understanding. The truth they sought would affect not just their family, but potentially many others. Richard's final confrontation with Clara occurred on a rainy Tuesday evening. He found her in her usual spot at the cafe, as if she had been waiting for him to return. This time, her customary composure showed cracks. Perhaps she too had realized that the time for secrets had passed. Emily came to me when she discovered she was pregnant. Clara began without preamble, her fingers wrapped tightly around an untouched cup of tea. She was barely 19, and the father was from a prominent African-American family in the city. Their relationship had been kept secret because of the social pressures both families would have faced. The revelation struck Richard like a physical blow. He remembered that period, Emily's increasing withdrawal from family events, her mysterious phone calls, the way she would change the subject whenever their parents asked about her future plans. Everything took on new meaning in light of this information. She knew both families would try to control the situation. Clara continued, her voice steady but quiet. The Hawthorns with their political ambitions, his family with their own social standing to consider. Emily refused to let her child become a scandal to be managed. She made the choice to disappear, to protect both her baby and the father's reputation. Clara explained how she had helped Emily establish a new identity in another state, where she lived quietly until Amara's birth. But complications during delivery had left Emily severely weakened. She made me promise, Clara's voice finally cracked, that if anything happened to her, I would make sure Amara found her way back to the Hawthorns, but only when the time was right, only when she could be accepted for who she was, not what she represented. The weight of this truth pressed down on Richard as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Emily's sudden disappearance, the careful orchestration of Amara's adoption, the identical birthmarks that had first caught his attention. His sister hadn't abandoned them. She had sacrificed everything to protect her child. Laura, who had insisted on accompanying Richard to this meeting, sat in stunned silence. Her hand found Richard's under the table, offering silent support as they absorbed the implications. Their adoption of Amara hadn't been chance. It had been the fulfillment of Emily's final wish, carefully orchestrated by Clara over years. "There's more," Clara said, reaching into her bag. She withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Emily left this for whoever in her family would eventually raise Amara. She knew someone would recognize the birthmark. It runs in your mother's family, though it sometimes skips generations. She hoped it would be you, Richard. She always said you were the one person in the family who valued truth over appearances. The revelation about Amara's true parentage transformed everything about their situation. The child they had chosen to make their daughter was, in fact, their niece by blood. The love they had developed for her remained unchanged, but their responsibility had deepened, now carrying the weight of Emily's trust and sacrifice. Laura watched as Richard struggled to process these revelations, noting how his hands trembled as he held Emily's letter. "This changes our legal status," she said quietly, her mind already working through the implications. "But it doesn't change who we are to Amara, who we've chosen to be." The days following Clara's revelation found Richard and Laura navigating uncharted emotional territory. They sat in their kitchen late into the night, Emily's letter placed between them on the marble countertop. discussing how to proceed with this newfound knowledge. The morning light would often find them still there, coffee cups cold and untouched, weighing the complexities of their situation. Richard had read Emily's letter countless times, each reading revealing new layers of his sister's thoughts and fears. She had written it from her hospital bed, knowing complications from childbirth might claim her life. The pages carried not just her words but her hopes for Amara's future, hopes that now rested squarely on Richard and Laura's shoulders. "My dearest family," the letter began. "If you're reading this, you've discovered what I couldn't tell you in person. Amara is more than just another child in need of a home. She's a bridge between worlds that fear connection, a living testament to love that transcends social boundaries. I chose to disappear not out of shame, but out of a fierce determination to give her a chance to define herself before the world could define her." Laura found herself watching Amara with new eyes, seeing traces of Emily in the way she would tilt her head when considering a painting, or in her quiet determination when facing a challenge. The girl remained unaware of the adults' turmoil, continuing her daily routines of school, art classes, and playdates with an innocence they desperately wanted to preserve. The legal implications loomed large in their discussions. As Amara's biological aunt and uncle, their adoption of her could be seen in a different light by the courts. Richard consulted discreetly with family lawyers, trying to understand how to protect their family unit while honoring Emily's wishes. The complexity of the situation was compounded by the need to shield Amara from any potential media attention. The Hawthorne name still carried enough weight to turn a private family matter into public spectacle. One evening, as they watched Amara reading in the garden, Laura voiced the fear that had been growing in her heart. What if knowing changes how she sees herself? How she sees us? The question hung heavy in the air between them. Richard had no immediate answer, understanding that their roles as parents now carried an additional weight. They needed to help Amara understand her heritage, without letting it overwhelm her identity. The question of Amara's biological father remained unresolved. Emily's letter provided no name, respecting his privacy, as she had always done. Richard struggled with this omission, part of him wanting to complete the picture of Amara's heritage, another part understanding that some secrets might need to remain buried for the greater good. Their conversations increasingly focused on practical matters, when and how to share the truth with Amara, what details were appropriate for her age, how to prepare her for questions she might face. Laura, drawing on her experience as a mother and her growing understanding of Amara's emotional needs, advocated for a gradual approach. She needs to feel secure in who she is now before we add the complexity of who she was born to be, she argued. Richard found himself agreeing, remembering how Emily's letter emphasized the importance of allowing Amara to develop her own identity. They began working with a child psychologist, speaking in hypotheticals about the best way to help a child understand complex family histories. The professional guidance helped them develop a framework for eventually sharing the truth, one that would prioritize Amara's emotional well-being above all else. The discovery of Emily's video felt like her final gift to the family. Richard found it while organizing the last of Clara's documents, a USB drive labeled simply for Amara. The video showed Emily, heavily pregnant, sitting in what appeared to be a small apartment. Her face glowed with both happiness and determination as she spoke directly to the camera. "My dearest Amara," Emily began, her voice strong despite her visible exhaustion. "I'm recording this so you'll know that every decision I made was out of love. Love for you, love for your father, and love for the family I hope will help raise you. The birthmark you carry isn't just a physical trait. It's a reminder of your connection to generations of strong women in our family who faced their own challenges with courage." Richard and Laura watched the video together in their study, tears flowing freely as Emily detailed her hopes for her daughter's future. She spoke about her relationship with Amara's father, describing their shared dreams and the painful realization that society wasn't ready for their love. But more importantly, she spoke about the family she knew would eventually embrace Amara, specifically mentioning Richard's capacity for understanding and acceptance. The video continued as Emily shared personal memories and family stories, creating a bridge across time between mother and daughter. She described the moment she first felt Amara kick, her dreams about who her daughter might become, and her fierce determination to protect her child's right to define herself. Most powerfully, she addressed her brother directly. "Richard, if you're watching this, you've already discovered what I always knew, that love transcends blood, that family is more than genetics. Trust your heart as you've always done." After multiple viewings and careful consideration, Richard and Laura decided to show the video to Amara. They chose a quiet Sunday afternoon, creating a safe and loving environment in their family room. Amara sat between them as Emily's face appeared on the screen, her eyes widening with recognition, the same face she had been drawing in her artwork all along. As the video played, Amara remained silent, but her hand found Laura's and held it tightly. When Emily spoke about the birthmark, Amara's other hand moved unconsciously to touch her shoulder. The connection between past and present, between birth mother and daughter, filled the room with an almost tangible energy. What surprised both Richard and Laura was Amara's response after the video ended. "I knew," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Not everything, but I knew she was important. She comes to me in my dreams, telling me I was loved, that I would be found by the right people." She turned to look at both her parents. "She meant you." The revelation that Amara had carried an innate understanding of her connection to Emily transformed their perspective on her artwork, her intuitive nature, and the immediate bond she had formed with Maya at the orphanage. She wasn't just surviving her circumstances, she was fulfilling a destiny that Emily had set in motion years ago. In that moment, Richard finally understood what Emily had known all along, that family transcends conventional boundaries, that love creates its own legitimacy. The truth they had uncovered didn't diminish their family, it expanded it, adding layers of meaning to their bonds rather than undermining them. Laura, who had worried about how this truth would affect their relationship with Amara, found her concerns dissolved by her daughter's simple acceptance. The girl's capacity to hold both her past and present with equal love demonstrated a wisdom beyond her years. "Can I still call you Mom and Dad?" Amara asked, looking between them. "Because that's who you are to me." This moment marked not an ending, but a new beginning for the Hawthorne family. They would face challenges, legal, social, and emotional, but they would face them together, strengthened by the truth rather than burdened by it. Emily's legacy lived on not just in Amara's birthmark or her artistic talent, but in the love that had brought them all together, a love that had transcended time, prejudice, and fear to create something beautiful and true. The story concluded not with answers to all questions, but with the understanding that some mysteries deserve to remain sacred, that some truths are felt rather than explained, and that family, in all its complex, beautiful forms, is the greatest legacy we can leave behind.